Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Clifford. I'm a policy manager with BC Nonprofit Housing Association, and I'm going to be helping facilitate the webinar today on the Policy Templates Guide. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that today's webinar is being delivered from various locations of unceded traditional territory across BC. I'm currently residing on the traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Tsawwassen, and Semiahmoo First Nation. And we acknowledge that many of you are currently located in the ancestral homelands of Indigenous peoples across the province, each with their own unique history and traditions. So we thank our Indigenous partners for allowing us to assemble today. So before I pass things over to my co-presenter, Luke, who will delve into the content of the guide and how to use it, I just wanted to take a few moments to set the context and provide background for how and why we engaged in the update to the policy template guide, as well as what we were trying to achieve with it. So the policy templates guide is one of BCNPHA's most accessed and downloaded resources. It provides written policy guidance on diverse operational issues such as tenant relations, financial management, and administration. Given the guide was first developed in 1999 and last updated in 2004, it required a thorough revision. So to do this, BCNPHA put out a request for a proposal and ultimately hired the law firm Jager Volkenant, or DJV, to assist us with the update. So we've invited Luke from DJV today to come talk about the guide, and he was instrumental in helping pull together the update. So I just want to take a second to kind of articulate what we were trying to accomplish with the update. And basically there's three things there. We wanted to remove irrelevant and outdated policies and add new policy templates as needed. We wanted to update the existing language or create new policy language for each template as required by updates to corresponding legislation. So for instance, there's been many changes to legislation since 2004, whether that's the Residential Tenancy Act, the Employment Standards Act, the Societies Act, or the BC Human Rights Code. So we wanted to incorporate those changes. We also wanted to incorporate changes to reflect concepts of diversity, inclusion, and equity, technological shifts such as remote work, new areas of interest such as resident relations, volunteer and staff development, ethics, and lobbying. So really, we were trying to modernize the guide to reflect the diversity of changes to the sector since 2004. So BCNPHA and DJV developed a gap analysis that assessed which templates were still current, which needed to be updated, and which were desired by the spectrum of nonprofit providers across BC. So to help facilitate this work as well, I should just mention that we convened a committee of industry and nonprofit society representatives to provide feedback on the templates and really to help guide the update process as well. So with that, the guide was officially released on June 2nd last week, and it's available for free of charge to all nonprofit providers or other stakeholders in the province. And there's a link right there for where you can access it. So now that I've kind of done a bit of that preamble, I'm going to hand things over to Luke Johnson, who's a lawyer at Jager Volkenant. And as I mentioned previously, he was instrumental in updating the policy guide. So just for a bit of background, DJV is a charity law firm based out of Surrey, and the firm represents organizations across the voluntary sector, including housing providers and charitable organizations. Luke himself provides legal advice to charities, nonprofits, businesses, and individuals in the area of charity law, corporate and commercial law, and wills and estates. He was admitted to the British Columbia Bar in 2008 and has served on the board of directors of a large housing society, so is intimately familiar with the kinds of policies we're about to discuss today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass things over to Luke and take it away.
Thanks very much, Brian. It's good to be here with you virtually. We always prefer to do this kind of thing in person if we can, but this is how we do meetings now. So thanks very much for taking some time this morning to attend this webinar. Always happy to participate in BC nonprofit housing projects like this. This was a really interesting assignment for us. I worked with a couple of other lawyers here at my firm to review the existing policies and update them, and we're pretty happy with the package that has been produced here. So and my objective here is to review the template guide and to talk about how your housing organization could implement some or all of these policies, and then have a bit of a case study in terms of how one policy could assist you in terms of making a decision about a particular issue. So if you could click through, Brian. From our perspective, one of the challenges of running a housing organization is that you have a real diversity of residents. You're always going to have unusual situations crop up. The only constant is the change of the dynamic of dealing with humans, individuals who are living in your building. And so the objective of setting up policies like this is to create a level playing field, consistency in terms of decision making, consistency in terms of tenant expectations, board expectations, volunteer expectations, so that people can know in advance what the requirements are, how they can comply, what the consequences are if they don't comply. Rather than making ad hoc decisions based on the characteristics of a unique situation, the idea is to set up policies that allow for consistent, cohesive decisions. And of course, there's always going to be an element of personal discretion where we're dealing with unusual situations or unique requirements. The policies are not designed to block your organization from doing that, but the idea is to make the running of the organization smoother to the degree we can. If you can click through, Brian. So there are 5 categories of policies dealing with financial management, governance and administration, essentially board decisions. There's a set of policies dealing with maintenance issues related to your building. Probably the most important section and the longest section is dealing with tenants, the back and forth day-to-day decision making for individual tenants, and then additional services, which would cover things like organizations that specifically provide housing for seniors, or if there are other unique aspects of the work that your organization does. If you can click to the next slide. So they cover, there's about 65 policies, which is reduced actually. We ended up removing some of the existing policies, combining some of the other ones. They touch on a wide range of issues. And so my hope is that following this webinar, or during this webinar perhaps, you can go to the BC Nonprofit Housing website, download the policy package, set it up, and just spend some time browsing through so that you get a sense of which ones might be useful to your organization, which ones would be consistent with how you already operate, which ones would be inconsistent. The intention here is that it's a very customizable package. And so it may be that you have a large, well-established organization. You only need 1 or 2 of these policies. You decide that it would be useful for you to have a policy around pets and pet damage. You haven't dealt with that before. The idea is that you can take this policy, add it to your overall package of existing policies, customize it to your specific building, your needs, your expectations for your tenants. Other organizations, perhaps a brand new housing organization that's just being set up, may decide to more or less adopt the whole package. again, you can pick and choose the ones that make sense for your organization. But the idea would be, rather than starting from scratch, or what clients often do, of course, is cobble together a wide range of inconsistent policies and documents from a diverse set of sources. So they may have American policies, they may have one from Alberta, there's one from Ontario that refers to the Ontario legislation, and then a couple borrowed from BC that refer to obsolete BC legislation. The idea of this package is that it's set up for BC organizations, because BC Nonprofit Housing Organization is very familiar with the types of issues that come up. It's specifically tailored to the kinds of problems that BC organizations can expect to have. There's consistency in terms of the references to the governing legislation, the Residential Tenancy Act. We're trying to limit that scenario of ending up in a, well, and I've had this happen to clients where they have a policy that refers to Ontario legislation or American legislation. And when push comes to shove and they're dealing with a resident or a board member about some issue, they find that their policy is not as good as it could be. So we've tried to preempt some of those problems and give you the kind of policies that you can adapt to deal with your unique situation. So the policies are, many of them cover options. And so this is it's not a template package that you can adopt without any consideration. You can't just drop in the name of your housing organization and consider that you're finished with this, because there are choices to be made, of course, based on your unique tenant requirements, based on your history as an organization and the pattern, the practices that you've adopted in the past, based on your agreements, pre-existing agreements that you have with funders or with residents. You can't necessarily adopt all of the options, or of course, you may not want to. Some of the options are discretionary, depending on your opinions about various operational or governance issues. So it is very much designed to be adapted to your situation. Part of the package includes an introduction, a set of instructions for what to do. So the idea here is that you have a new housing organization, let's call it the BC Housing Society. You're setting up a new building, you're bringing on board new directors, new members perhaps, new residents for your organization. And part of your work to be done is setting up a brand new policy manual that will govern how the work is to be carried out. So the instructions then are to download the package, discuss and review the policy points. To me, that would mean going through all 65, deleting the ones that are irrelevant to you, and then having someone on your board or staff or volunteer go through and flag decision points to be made. So some of the options just are not suitable for you. Perhaps you don't have common space that is shared by the residents, so you can delete those policies. But there's some work to be done in terms of customizing to your own unique requirements. If the options, some of the options, of course, are separated by or, meaning that you have to choose option A or B. You can't have both of them. Some of them are, you could have either or, you can have both. It's up to you. There's flexibility built in. So you may have additional policies that are unique to your situation. You have a swimming pool, and so you need to have a policy about access to the swimming pool, or children using it, or guests, or whatever it is. So there's certainly room for you to craft your own policy handbook that also deals with external or additional policies that are relevant. The formatting is, it's been set up in a consistent format by BC Nonprofit Housing, but of course you can adapt the format as necessary and change the numbering or whatnot. You can, before it's finalized, you would delete our instructions. It's in boldface type. You fill in dates when the policy is passed and approved. If you're replacing pre-existing policies, it's a good practice to say at the bottom or in the footer. This new conflict of interest policy is adopted as of September 1st, 2021. It replaces the 1997 conflict of interest policy. Just so if there's any dispute or people are trying to determine which policy is to be followed, it's as clear as possible about which is the current policy. My recommendation for most of these policies is to, well, you'll see in the templates, in many cases, it will say things like, double check this policy against your funder agreements or your financing agreements or your existing tenancy agreements or your municipality's requirements. There can be some unique requirements that each individual organization will need to comply with. And so there is some work to be done in that sense. There's also a disclaimer to say that while we believe that the policies are current and comply with BC legislation and Canadian requirements, we are not your lawyers for the purpose of drafting these policies for you. It's a good policy. It's a good practice to have these reviewed by your own lawyers as part of setting up the policy handbook. The final step then would be to seek approval from the board of directors. I consider that it's a good practice to have your board review and approve policies. I know that some regulators or oversight bodies consider that necessary. So in my role as a director of a housing organization, I reviewed dozens of policies and they were updated periodically, sometimes every few years as necessary. So that's a big task to ask your board to review 65 odd policies. But I think it is a useful measure to have the board understand what the policies of the organization are and give formal approval to those when they're being implemented. The last step then would be for the society to set up a review calendar to say that perhaps we're going to review 5 or 10 policies every year so that we're on a 7-year cycle or something like that. Or we'll do it on an ad hoc basis as necessary as the legislation changes or as our funding situation changes. We will deliberately review and update or delete policies as necessary. The 20 odd policies that deal with tenants can be set up into the tenancy handbook. It would be I think a standard practice that you would have a tenancy handbook to supplement your tenancy agreement. So of course you don't need to include policies around building maintenance or governance issues, but it should be set up so that tenants or residents are aware of what the requirements are. They know what the expectations are of them. And so part of the final part of the rollout for a policy handbook would be to determine which ones are relevant to individual tenants and then share that with them, make that available so that there's consistency about expectations. So that's the next slide. I've covered most of that. And as I say, the idea here is that the handbook or the template guide can be used by a brand new organization that needs to set up a whole suite of policies, or it can be used by an existing society that already has some or all of these and wants to. I think it's a worthwhile practice to say, well, we have a pet policy. Let me see what the BC nonprofit housing pet policy is, and let's compare them. Let's see if this new policy that has been shared is better than our existing policy or worse or just different. How can we adapt it? Is there a way that we can come up with the best policy that is suitable for the needs of our organization, the needs of our residents? That's the idea. So in that sense, while we think that these policies are sound, and they have been reviewed, as Brian said, by a very helpful committee of volunteers from the sector, there's always room to have them tailored to your unique needs. So if you can click through to the next slide then. So I wanted to chat about, well, I should say first, there have been a couple of questions that have come in, and so maybe I'll deal with those now. But if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. somehow policy type webinars tend to attract very detailed questions. And so it may be that if a question is too detailed or narrow, I'll just get your name after and I can send you an email or schedule a call with you about some particular issue. But if you do have questions generally about some of the policies or about the process for implementing these, please put those into the chat. So the two questions that had come from people so far were one question about the use of the verbs. So whether policies should say may or will or shall. We have generally used the word will, well, the verbs will and may. So may to indicate that there's an option, the board may do this or they may do that, and then will to say that a person, a tenant or the board is required. There's an obligation to do something or other. So we have generally observed that. Shall comes up in a few of the policies, but in many cases we have shifted to will instead. So as you look at those verbs, as you're reviewing your own policy, it's worth thinking about, are we imposing an obligation here where there is no flexibility, or are we creating an opportunity for a choice, some flexibility built in? And that, of course, that has to be, it's something to be determined depending on what the issue is. So there was another question about whether or not our tenancy agreement should refer to the policy. And the other project that we've worked on for BC Nonprofit is a new tenancy agreement. It's included in the package of policies. And one of the lines in the tenancy agreement is a confirmation that the tenant is required to comply with the rules and policies of the society, of the landlord organization, let's call it. So it is appropriate from my perspective to require tenants to comply with your policies as insofar as they apply to residents. Of course, you're not going to refer them to all of these policies because some of them are just irrelevant, the maintenance ones or the governance ones. But the challenge can be proving that tenants have been made aware of the policies that apply to them, that they have had a fair opportunity to become aware of changes to those policies as they're made from time to time. So if the board changes the PET policy, it's generally, while the tenancy agreement does allow the board to change that, or the landlord, let's say, to change the policy from time to time, there's an element of fairness required to make sure that people have fair notice. Perhaps is there going to be a transitional period where pets of a certain size or weight, whatever the requirement is, how is that going to be implemented? What is the timing? So part of the complexity of setting up these policies, of course, is to turn your mind to the issues of how can that be done in a way that's fair? We can make sure that all of the residents are aware of the new requirements as they change from time to time. And if there's any disputes, that we have a mechanism to deal with those disputes. So the case study that I wanted to deal with, of course, eviction is a fairly common problem that comes up. And it's the kind of problem where there's, I think, a real risk of inconsistency. And of course, residents seize on this kind of inconsistency. We've dealt with these kinds of files where a person the organization is making a decision to evict someone for some particular reason. And of course, their immediate response is, well, so-and-so in unit 201 also did that and they weren't evicted. Therefore, how is this fair? And there's favoritism and this is abusive. These kinds of decisions can be fraught with, we're dealing with someone's housing, and obviously it's significant to them. It can be emotional. These can be difficult files. And so the value of having a sound eviction policy is that the executive director or the property manager or the board chair or whoever is making these decisions has a consistent framework. We have already determined in advance what our system is. We have compared that against the Residential Tenancy Act requirements, assuming they apply to your particular organization. So when you go into one of these difficult situations, you can feel that your organization has a solid foundation for making this eviction decision, communicating that to the resident. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have any problems, but it means that if there's a dispute, you can, you're on solid ground in terms of telling the resident, these are our expectations. These have always been the expectations. You were made aware of this at the time your tenancy started. We have been scrupulously fair in terms of providing you with notice as required by our policy and making the decision fairly. It provides you with the foundation that you need to defend the decision, and as much as possible takes some of that emotion or stress out of what can be a very difficult decision. So the idea here is that you're setting up a brand new organization. You don't have an eviction policy. You're starting to get residents in. You make a decision, well, we are in due course going to need to evict someone. Let's look at the BC nonprofit housing policy on this. We set it up. You download the policy. Brian has put it up here on the screen for us. So you go up to the top, you drop in your organization name. You go through the options here. Let me put through on my screens to find that. And you've gone through you've adopted the policy guide, so you understand what the role of the policy, and you've looked at the options. If you can see, I don't know if you can see on the screen there, I don't know if you can zoom that out, Brian, but we've got some options about who is making these decisions. Is this the general manager, the board of directors? Do we have a tenant relations committee? What is our process for making a determination about when to evict someone? And the idea here is that, of course, your general manager, let's say, can go to the policy and say, what is our basis for the eviction? And assuming it's, let's say it's not for non-payment of rent, it's on a different basis. Who needs to make that decision? How many warning letters do we need to send? Is this not an emergency situation where we need to make an emergency eviction, but it's a non-emergency, but problematic enough that we need to proceed with an eviction. So what is our process for sending letters? What are the requirements that arise under our funding agreement? Do we already have a tenancy agreement in place that guarantees people certain protections, or say an opportunity to meet with the general manager and explain why they shouldn't be evicted? To what degree have you set that up? And of course, because you're setting up a new society, you don't have any pre-existing constraints around your existing tenancy agreements. You're just bound by the Residential Tenancy Act and other the statutory requirements. But perhaps you decide that would be a fair policy for your organization to enable people to make representations, send a letter to explain why they shouldn't be evicted, have a meeting. The idea, as I say, is to set up a fair process that walks the general manager through what the process needs to be, and also provides the idea here would be that the tenant can look at this themselves and say, while I am obviously upset about being evicted, at least I can say that the organization has followed the steps that they told me they would follow. So yeah, that's the case study. If you can click back to the PowerPoint then, Brian. So we have that. This is essentially what I was, oh, sorry, if you can click back. So the idea here is that, and sorry, one more forward after that, slide 12. So the property manager, general manager, goes through the policy that has been adopted. We issue the warning. We refer the tenant back to our policy to say, we're not doing this based on personal dislike or something like that. This is the portion of the policy that you've breached. This is a fair process that we're imposing on you. If, for example, your policy requires the executive director or the board of directors approves the notice before an eviction is carried out, we go through that process. Let's say the tenant disputes the notice, and then we're into a different policy. We have a dispute resolution internal policy potentially that would be followed. If your organization, of course, is covered by the Residential Tenancy Act, then you may end up in a residential tenancy proceeding about the eviction. But at least there could be an option for a less formal, private, internal dispute resolution. Perhaps it's just a misunderstanding, or there's something that can be, some confusion that can be clarified, and so we can actually resolve it internally. Some of the, it's possible to implement the policy handbook or to adapt these policies in stages. So one of my, it's a pretty substantial project to implement 65 of these. So my recommendation generally for new organizations that are setting up policies, or organizations that are looking at reviewing, updating, overhauling their existing policy handbook, would be to perhaps divide the year into 4 quarters or something like that, and to work on one section at a time. So it may be that you start with the board policies. You go through the handbook here has 7 board policies related to board evaluations, committees, conflict of interest, meeting and attendance, reporting relationships, succession, recruitment. So that's to my mind, that's a substantial piece of work for an organization. It's the kind of thing where you could have a committee or a volunteer director go through these 7 policies, tailor them to your organization's needs, come up with a draft that would be reviewed at the September board meeting. They can be approved, and then before your December board meeting, let's say, you would deal with the maintenance package, go through the maintenance policies, make sure that aligns with your needs. Over the course of a year, it seems workable to my mind to set up all of the policies you need. Then you could perhaps take a year or 2 off and revisit them or adapt them again the year after. So that's really all I have for the presentation. I'm happy to take questions. Let me see if there's any questions here in the chat, or if Brian has received anything.
No questions right now, but what I was thinking about maybe doing is just showing people how to access the resource on the website. I know that I provided a bit of a link there, but I thought I would just go through and just make sure that people understand where to find the resource. So
sure, yep.
Just quickly bring up the BCNPHA site here. Give me one moment. Share my screen again. Right, so from the BCNPHA homepage here, you're gonna go to resources, go down to templates and guides. And then from there, it is the first piece here, the policy and tenancy templates. So you'll go and download the template. It'll provide a zip file. If you open that up, let me just go to that quickly. It'll provide all the policy templates that we've been discussing. So right there, you have a list of all the policies in an Excel file. You have the introduction on how to use it, as well as the 65 policies that we've worked on here. In addition to that, you can find the tenancy template, which is also included in this package. So just thought I would quickly share that with everyone.
Brian, there was a question about record data management or record keeping. Do you mind opening up policy 15, or policy 14?
Yeah, sure.
Record keeping policy, just to
give me one
show
second here.
how that could be done.
So it's number 15?
Number 14.
14, sorry.
So there was a question from someone in the chat about sort of which policy would be appropriate for data management or record keeping. This would be, I think, the starting point for that. One of the challenges of doing a policy manual like this, of course, is that it's possible to have another 100 policies that might be relevant to some organizations. And so, of course, your organization may decide that you need to have a specific policy dealing with some issue, or you might be satisfied with a more general policy that governs, say, record keeping broadly, dealing with corporate records and that kind of thing. There's always it's a balancing act to be specific enough to provide guidance about a wide range of issues. Well, broad enough, but also specific enough to deal with questions that come up on a day-to-day basis about, can we delete this? So this is a starting point that could be used for that, those kinds of decisions. It goes through the requirements in terms of what does, well, first the society will comply with things like PIPA here in BC, or Information Management Act, the Societies Act. What are the documents that are relevant to us as a charity, if our organization is in fact a charity? So it's a starting point. It would be tailored as necessary for the needs of your organization. I would say more very sophisticated organizations that have perhaps online, or we're storing documents in the cloud, we're concerned about backups and access. This kind of document would require more tailoring to deal with the technology issues or those kinds of things that come up. So. Brian, do you want me to talk about the tenancy agreement here for a few minutes? As
yeah, I think that'd be great.
If you could pull that up. So the other, as I was saying, the other piece of work that we've done for BC Nonprofit is to develop this model or template tenancy agreement. This is a critical document, of course, for housing organizations. It's the foundation of your relationship with your residents. It's going to be the key document that enables you to, well, collect rent, but also deal with evictions, deal with disputes, deal with moving people in and out of their units, changes during the course of their tenancy. So as I'm sure you all know, it's a highly regulated area. So the provisions that you are allowed to have in your agreement, or that you must have, are set out essentially by the Residential Tenancy Act, but they differ substantially based on the kind of funding that you receive, the kind of organization that you are, in terms of, you see the highlighted points there. Some organizations have, well, some are not bound by the Act, some are absolutely bound by the Act. So as you're, again, it's a substantial project for an organization to take this template and adapt it to your own situation. But I think that's would be a fantastic project to take on, particularly if you have a dated agreement that has been around for a decade or two and hasn't recently been updated. Comparing your existing agreement against this new form of agreement, or starting with this new form and adapting to implementing this across the board, would be very worthwhile, I think, for most organizations. The process for doing that will be to first situate yourself in terms of what kind of organization are you? Where do you receive your funding? What category of people do you serve? Based on how that is, based on where you land, what are the requirements, and how do you have to adapt this document to your unique needs? And then, as with the other policies, there's options. So you have some choices about, do we I mean, some of them are regulated, you can't change them. Some of them you do have some discretion to make changes to suit your requirements or your expectations for your tenants. It'll take some work, so I don't think we need to go through all of the details there. But for example, this section, paragraph 5, dealing with rent, are you a market, low end of market kind of organization, or are you a rent geared to income? Of course, there's different provisions about obtaining information from your resident about their household income and then assessing that against your criteria. So it just depends on the kind of organization that you are and what you'd like to do. Much of this has been drawn from precedent documents. BC Nonprofit Housing had a precedent agreement. BC Housing has a precedent agreement that we reviewed as well. And so we've attempted to integrate those various documents into one template that can be used now, that's current and up to date. Let me check the chat here again to see if there's any questions.
So it looks like we have a question regarding data retention.
From Jessica, the policy 14 that I referred to begins to deal with this. So, and particularly with, there's some about financial or operational information, but it's it perhaps is a more detailed question than I can respond to right now. It's going to depend on whether or not you're a registered charity, for example, because registered charities have certain requirements to Canada Revenue Agency as a regulator, which mere nonprofits don't necessarily have. So there's an element of, again, of situating your organization to determine which obligations apply to you, and then deciding which do you want to be as conservative as possible? You hold on to everything. Do you want to, which is not great, or are you going to implement a policy of deleting things after 7 years or whatever it is? So there's still some flexibility, but the policy should give you some guidance about where to go there. So.
That's great. So does anyone else have any other questions? We'll just give it another couple seconds here for people to enter that into the chat. You can also unmute yourself and just kind of ask the question directly.
As I said at the beginning, this was an interesting exercise for me to go through and the other lawyers here. I would be really happy if someone could call me in 6 months and say, my Kamloops Housing Society has gone through this exercise. We have implemented these policies, and here's how it went. So if you go through this exercise of adapting this to your situation and you find that this is helpful or not helpful, or too confusing or not comprehensive enough, we'd be happy to have that feedback. You could pass that along, I think, to Brian at BC Nonprofit, or to me. My email address is in the presentation. Happy to field questions about it. My assumption is that BC Nonprofit will do another review of this, perhaps in 5 years or at some point as necessary. And so if you have feedback, of course, the templates can be updated at any time if there's something critical that needs to be done. But if you have feedback about policies that would be useful and are not included, or the process that your organization goes through to implement that, that would be really helpful for us.
Yeah,
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Is there anything in the manual regarding cannabis, recreational cannabis and medical cannabis use, and policies for handling those?
Yeah, let's see.
There are.
Just looking for the number here. I think where this ended up, Brian, is as an attachment to the template tenancy agreement.
I seen on the web page where we downloaded the policy and templates, there's another link for cannabis.
Yeah, you can find that there. Also, as Luke mentioned, in the tenancy agreement, there is a clause, an optional clause that we include related to cannabis use and smoking in general.
Mhm. The non-medical, or sorry, the medical use is quite, they haven't really defined the policies yet, as I understand, because there's a certain amount of legislation or interpretation of the guidelines for medical situations, and that must be, you know, that we must adapt to the needs of the person if they're medically proven. I'm wondering whether there's a requirement that we ask for a medical prescription to prove that the person is on a medical prescription as opposed to using it recreationally.
Yeah, it's a difficult issue for organizations because it's at the intersection of, well, I mean, coming out of a criminal regime, but now there's a medical overlay and human rights obligations that have to be observed. I don't specifically do that kind of work here at the firm, so I'm not. I don't think I should answer your question in terms of saying, are you on solid ground in asking for medical evidence? But it's something that, as the tenancy agreement contemplates here, should be addressed up front for organizations so that they can tell residents right up at the beginning of the tenancy, this is where we have ended up in terms of marijuana use, cannabis use, and this is our expectation. So.
Thank you very much.
And I'm seeing that, Sophia, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I actually had a question. So, for example, in the policies, I know on the last example that you showed with the Tenancy and the Tenancy Act, are there other sections like with respect to payroll or HR or things like that that are within the template that refer to different acts? And I guess the thing is, we as an organization would have to make sure that we're up to date with the changes in those acts as well, because if we're referring to them in the policy and then the act changes and we're not aware of what's changed in the act, there is a bit of an onus for us to know, I guess, updates.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the challenges of running an organization, particularly when you have a volunteer board and you have, you know, perhaps 4 or 5 individual employees, but you're responsible for compliance with human rights laws, privacy laws. Perhaps you're a charity, and so you have the overlay of CRA obligations. You're an employer, and so you have all of the regular employment obligations that go along with that. You're a property owner, and so you have all the, we've got a new transparency registry in Canada. In BC, we have property tax complications. There's one of the objectives here is to try and simplify or try and assist organizations with all of those onerous requirements, because honestly, you can't. It seems impossible for a full-time person to deal with all of that, let alone your volunteer directors who have day jobs and other things to do, right? So again, maybe I'll start with that. I commiserate. It is difficult, and the government, particularly during this COVID period, of course, has been changing the regulations and requirements around tenancies and evictions. And I think I was talking to Brian just before the meeting about sort of the change to a hybrid workflow where people are working from home or working in the office. That's a pretty dramatic change for employers to grapple with. And it's happening in real time right in front of you, right? So as an employer, you're going to have to make a decision about technology use and people working from home. And I guess I just want to acknowledge that even a small organization is grappling with a huge number of issues. So hopefully these policies simplify that to some degree, but it doesn't take away from the obligation to stay current and to update your policies when you can, as legislation changes, as the requirements change. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you're relying on a particular section of a particular act, and then your tenant is saying, well, don't you know that that was amended 2 years ago? That doesn't apply anymore. So that happens. It happens to lawyers. But the idea of doing this policy review now is to catch as many of those as we could, and to deliver you a template package that, as much as possible, has ironed out those issues. So.
Thank you. So we have a question. So they say, just to clarify, the procedural points to consider in the template are not to be included in the final document. They're just used as a discussion. Is that right? And
right.
That is correct. I mean, Luke, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, the idea there is to just flag for you that before you adopt this policy, you should consider various issues. So it may be that your funding agreement with your funder sets out specific requirements about something. So before you adopt a formal policy, there's going to be some checking required. But once you've crossed that off your list, you can say, well, the funding agreement doesn't deal with this. Just delete that section and clean up the policy in that sense.
Great. And we have another question. Is there an intention to keep updating to create more and additional policies, or is this recent update the selected bundle for now? And yeah, it's a great question. We are going to use this as kind of the bundle for now, but as need arises, and if there's that desire for further policies, that's something that BCNPHA can look at updating in the future. Any other questions from folks here? Maybe we'll just give it another couple seconds, and if not, we can wrap up a little bit early here. I'm not seeing anything else come through the chat. Does anybody want to ask a question directly? Okay, well, hearing nothing, I think that this is a great place to wrap up. I just want to thank you, Luke, so much for doing that presentation and walking us through the guide.
Sure.
That was super helpful. And I just want to thank everyone. And yes, this recording will be available on the website. We will send that out. And please keep in touch on this resource. I'm available, brian@bcnpha.ca, if you have any questions. And we thank you for participating today.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.